Hey, there's so much to talk about lately. There's so many misunderstandings and confusions, and that's good. Why? Why do I say that? When we are in an era where we can't agree on the interpretation of symbols, even though we can read the symbols, and then basically we're in a situation of paradigm shift. Okay? In a situation of paradigm shift, the very same symbols become reinterpreted. And this is one of the confusions about what a paradigm shift really is. So, see, a lot of people think that a paradigm shift is like some new consciousness raising, and I describe it more as consciousness shifting. It's not a vertical thing. The yes, there are many vertical things in the world. If you understand geometry, you understand that the world is inherently rich with levels and hierarchies. Okay. All you have to do is know the basic concepts of scale, and that we have micro scale and macro scale and everything in between. Okay. It's not hard. Yes, hierarchy is basically the inherent scaling of physics. Okay. That's all it is. Right. It's like physics and geometry inherent, so we can't get rid of physics and geometry, so that's not an interesting or intelligent conversation. When we're talking about integralism or metamodernism, when we're talking about culture, these are cultural arguments, cultural movements. They are not valid physics. They are not valid academic science of any discipline. They are not psychology. They are what they are. Culture is popular. It begins as popular philosophy, which becomes popular art. Okay. And there's a really fun play on words here I want to get into. It's not by accident. Cults versus culture. How do we describe them as different? A cult is basically a set of simple ideas that capture the minds of some people to such a sense that it becomes a totalizing concept. Even if they don't intend it to be, like maybe they came in contact with the cult and originally they resisted it, but the longer that the people keep re-insisting and regurgitating the same words and the same concepts, eventually the brain becomes retrained to see a harmony, to see harmonies. Okay. So let's say, for example, you're talking about a cult revival, like religious revivalism, charismatic Christianity. At first you resist, but the longer that you are constantly bombarded with the emotional experiences of the other members of the revival, and the more they keep hitting you over and over and over with the same words, the same rituals, the same actions, and the same behaviors, you start becoming psychedelically sympathetic. Your mind starts creatively adapting to that artistry, that patterning. And so it becomes eventually true for you, in the same way that an addict becomes addicted to heroin, and that the body then becomes dependent on an incomplete solution. And so what's just like with addiction in a cult, there's an escalating problem that the longer that it goes on, the more aggressively the ideology needs to insist on itself, and the more it needs to shut out any other alternatives. By it needs to recapitulate itself like genetic, like an organism, and it needs to breed out any competing structures or reasoning. And then it eventually collapses And that's and when cults collapse, it's because what happens is that humans come up with these ideas, beautiful ideas, ideas that are beautiful enough that the brain sees symmetry in them. It sees beauty. It sees some sort of like maybe even ecstatic response to the belief that is being promoted. And those sorts of activities go on regularly in human history. And they're even evident in just sales, like car salesmen. And when they basically get you head nodding, and they use various different suggestive structures and techniques to get you to synchronize with them and to mirror them. Neurolinguistic programming, you know, the number one rule of neurolinguistic programming is mirroring. I need to get you into a rhythm and coax your mind into a pattern or a rhythm, and eventually that rhythm feels good, and then now it becomes musical. And once it becomes musical, we can use the language of musical emphasis to basically enhance the argument. And so the idea becomes musical, and that's geometric, and it all becomes symmetrical and beautiful. And that's really at the heart of a lot of great art, is trying to create these sort of like enchanting, beautiful things. And so cult behaviors, when you basically say, this art, this beautiful concept that I created is going to defeat the world. It's going to overtake it. I'm going to just meditate on these ideas and then chant them and repeat them and use ritual to defeat science, to defeat physics, to defeat alternative politics, to defeat alternative tribes, to defeat any other kinds of symmetries that might be working against it. So I really want people to understand culture as predominantly from art. It is about beauty. It's not about truth. It's not about goodness. It's about beauty. So from the Goethe perspective, those are the gute, schöne, wahre, the good, the beautiful, the true. And these are some of the greatest things that humans can create. You know, the true is the science, the beautiful is the arts, and the good is the philosophy, ethic, or moral practice. And so what the cult does is it works with the beautiful, and it tries to overtake everything else. Truth and goodness become subsumed to the beautiful. And the way that happens is that basically artistic creation says, I don't need something to be true. I need your brain to love it. That's all I need. And so sales, marketing, advertising, creative activities, attentionalism, where we're trying to grab people's attention. What's it all about? Artistic activities that are trying to convince your brain to get on certain wavelengths and to keep magnifying and repeating those wavelengths. It's also how propaganda works. But so anyway, that's it's art. It's what's beautiful to your mind. And what people do to make it propagandistic is they basically try to manipulate your mind by taking something that resonates with you and overextending it until it drowns out all other kinds of resonances. And a cult basically is this process where the person gets caught up in or lost in the resonances that have been produced. And this becomes really easy to see in psychedelic experiments. So anyone who's ever done a bunch of acid or mushrooms or whatever and got into social relations with other people and tried to see if they could use suggestion to manipulate other people's hallucinations, it becomes really clear in those social environments that the masters of manipulation on psychedelics are those who use beauty and symmetry and rhythm and balance and all of these artistic design tools to try to sculpt a tautology, a supersymmetry, a super tautology, a sort of cadence, a rhythm where it always feels compelled that you must go to the next step. The next step is inevitable because you can't go backwards, and there and nothing else is offering you the same kind of reward psychologically. And so really cults basically collapse when those forms of art, as I said, run up against competitors, and more importantly, where practical circumstances occur where the art fails and the beautiful ideas become internally contradictory or even downright awful. And so anyway, so what happens in the dynamic of culture is that almost all ideas start out as art or philosophy, and they start off as playing around with the general design principles. You know, that's what you learn in any great art school, is that you work with general design principles. And that if you become a really ambitious artist, you eventually realize you can apply these things to society. And that a truly great artist or designer is essentially practicing some sort of occultism, where they're basically steering reality, asserting their will on humanity and the direction of it by getting other people to synchronize with them in an artistic movement. And that a very genius artist is somebody who can basically manipulate people to such an extent they get them to do things they otherwise wouldn't, and they get them to reverse their opinions or morals or behaviors towards other things for some cause. And so the fine line between a culture hacker and a propagandist is that a culture hacker basically is running cultural experimentation or doing individual hacks, whereas the propagandist basically tries to channel that towards some larger political movement or commercial activity, where it's faux art. It's not really speaking to the art, the beautiful. It's manipulating you with beautiful things for some alternative purpose, and often ugly purposes. And one of the ways they do that is they contrast the beauty of the thing that they're trying to promote against the ugliness of the thing that they're trying to oppose or manipulate you to be against, such as when the Nazis drew Jews as being these strange creatures that were subhuman and weird, and then through repetition convincing people to frame it that way cognitively, and then frame the German as the perfect, beautiful ideal. That's how they got people involved in the Nazi program, was to sell Nazism as beauty. Okay, horrible. So let's get back to the point. In the cultural process, the inventors of these artistic movements never achieve their goals. These cults always collapse. Every cult that has ever started. I mean, you could say it's tautological that I'm defining it as a cult, but really what I'm saying is every one of these beauty movements of ideology that try to convince you that the world as it is doesn't exist or is inferior to the world that is being created because it's less beautiful. So every such movement eventually hits reality, and it has to fail. And that this is actually the core of complexity collapse. So whenever everyone talks about complex systems and systems collapse, I'm always like, God, what is this obsession with the word collapse? Why do we always try to describe civilizations as collapsing or what that? Well, so I've never really been fond of the word. And the reason why is because the word itself is not properly theorized. And so here's what I call a collapse. A collapse is basically when a beautiful object has reached the limits of its ability to reproduce its logic such that it is no longer acts like a growing organism, that it acts like a dying organism. And why does it happen? It happens because it reaches real limits to its ability to assume everything. And so this could apply to civilizations, it could apply to politics, it could apply to cultures, whatever sort of like terminology you want to calibrate it towards. It has a broad use for all social systems. So I'm really talking about the social. All social systems, but most especially cultural systems, are attempts to create more symmetrical, beautiful, smooth, consistent, rational. See, the thing is, when we talk about all these words like rational or whatever in like spiral dynamics and metamodernism, pre-rational or or this sort of pre-trans and all that kind of stuff, I always kind of stop them and say, are you really sure you know what those words mean? Because it doesn't seem like you do, because you're using them as if they're so like opposite, rather than just being different flavors of the exact same thing. What is rationality? As my mentor Barry Mitnick and I often argued, rationality is basically consistency. All rationality is, when we use this word, is to say the map matches the territory, or the idea matches the action. Okay. And so when you say, okay, there was a double fit between, as John Searle says, word to world and world to word. When you have a word world fit, an idea reality fit, then we can say that the idea that motivates the reality is rational, because it is consistent. Now, this is not exactly the same thing as the correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory of truth is that truth is when there is a corresponding reality to the truth claim. So you would say, is it raining outside? Yes or no? And then you could evaluate whether or not the claim corresponds to what's going on outside the window. So that is the correspondence theory of truth. This is what I'm talking about is a correspondence theory of beauty, not of truth. There's no truth here. Okay. Put truth to the side. We're talking about when systems are trying to insist on beauty as the answer to a problem, symmetry, consistency, elegance, parsimony, all these basically kinds of what we could, like what we say in science is that every great theory is actually pretty. It's pretty. And why do we say it's a great theory? Is it really because it's true? Or is it because human minds love pretty things? I think it's more the latter. Human minds love pretty things, and we pick which theories are great theories based on how pretty we think they are. And there are objective ways to measure beauty. But basically, that's the strongest metric of a theory or an idea, is its beauty, not its truth or its goodness. And so that's how you really persuade people. And so cults are all about persuading people to buy into beauty and to convince everyone that it is beauty. We're experiencing beauty. Awe comes from beauty, that sort of thing. You see the Grand Canyon and you feel awe, that's beauty, And beauty, though, therefore, it has this interrelationship to basically something that is so beyond our tiny selves that we're just stunned by the fact that it even exists. And it makes us meditate on everything. It basically is a creative spark. Beauty inspires more beauty. Beauty inspires more creation. And then a cult basically tries to channel that energy that you've created towards the goal of the leadership of the cult. And then eventually it collapses because that leadership fails to use beauty to solve the problems that the cult has created for itself, such as financing itself, feeding people, taking care of all the basic practical concerns of what the cult's trying to achieve. That eventually the beauty of the ideas are insufficient to maintain the momentum, and the collapse is when you have a crystalline structure. It's a way of, this is a nice metaphor, but it's almost true. It's almost literal. With beauty collapsing, you have a crystalline structure that has been growing upon itself in many dimensions and seeing itself as a jewel or a gem, all the way up until the point that it causes itself to fracture. And it causes itself to fracture when it comes up against other gems. Okay, so two civilizations, both growing in many dimensions and harmonizing and adding layers and layers and harmonies upon itself, adding cultural layers and scientific and technical layers to itself, and becoming bigger and badder and more expansive. Eventually, it comes up against other things that are also doing that, other civilizations and so forth. And so it notices that it has boundaries. And the thing is that there are certain physical and other kinds of truth limits to the possibility of the ideas alone motivating a victory over the other systems that it's running up against. So say the Romans against the Egyptians. And so when the ideas alone either become self-defeating, tainted, or basically drawing more antagonism against it than it's creating as a protagonistic force, then what happens is it's not that it just falls down, it gets displaced. This is why I don't believe in theories of civilization collapse the way they're usually described, as if, oh, we just fell apart. That's not what happens. What happens is that civilizations are displaced by other systems that are more true. And that truth is also often ugly. And so you have this beautiful pseudo-truth that keeps expanding and growing and getting human beings to replicate behaviors and to synchronize their behaviors. And so as we reach this sort of like gem-like synchronicity in a society, we feel like we've found a beautiful society. But then eventually we run up against other social forces which undermine the beauty of it with truth that is more useful. And so that could be something like a shock, like a famine or war or something of that nature, where basically the idea that was perpetuating the society reaches its hard limits with physical contact. Or it could be simply overtaken by rival beautiful ideas. And so like every bubble, every economic bubble, social bubble, cultural bubble, every macro bubble of social systems operate on the principle of beautiful wrong ideas that host people's minds and steer human interrelations on the basis of beauty that is unsustainable. And so when a cult does it, it's obvious. But then when a culture does it, we're often confused, because we think of cultures as supposedly inherently practical things or rational things, that we use cultures to, do our grocery shopping, to get a job, to, get married and all these sorts of things. So we don't often think about cultures as rituals of beauty. But all of the social practices that we're doing, it's sort of, as Alan Watts described it, as the human dance, as an order of pattern of rhythms, where if you saw us from 10,000 feet and you look carefully, we would just be doing these rhythmic synchronous behaviors all around the world, going through our motions and our routines. And the thing is that as long as those routines connect beauty to truth, the cultures are functional. But a cult is where there's an intent to try to revolutionize beauty and take culture in new directions, and then test whether or not human systems can operate under those principles. And that cults get so far because they often they lend you some pretty good prophetic vision, because, you know, the wonderful thing about beauty is that it actually is the strongest force for predicting human behavior. Because I know that if people in the future are enamored by the beauty of an idea, they will act on it. And therefore, I can predict future human behavior based on our tendencies to like things and to become caught up into systems of supersymmetries. We love supersymmetry. We love it because it's how we try to create a growing systems. Okay. So my claim, now that I've made this perfectly clear, my primary critiques of metamodernism and integralism is that there are beauty cults that are non-sustainable, that are infectious because they are based on prior beauty cults. So the non-dualist tradition of culture goes back to the very dawn of religion and humanity. And the non-dual tradition was basically a cult of supersymmetrical, super tautological beauties, gems of hyperdimensional space. So basically, Vedic mythology, for example, some of the earliest Gnostic religions, earliest occultist religions were all about geometric symmetries and patterns, numbers and shapes and pentagrams and circles, and using these various different sacred geometries to construct complex non-dualistic symmetries that seem to condition the mind to see beauty. That's what's really going on. That's really what these cultural innovations are, or they are trainings and conditionings of artists to influence other people to see the angles of beauty or the patterns of beauty that they want to stress. Okay. And so the earliest philosophers of non-dualism were all describing reality as this big, beautiful, complex system of which there are certain special geometries. And once you know some of the basic geometries, you realize that everything can harmonize. Taoism was very much like this, you know. Everything is constantly undoing itself, and then there's all these symmetries between day and night and black and white, and then but they're always like dynamic symmetries, and that whenever you think you know the thing, you don't know the thing, and anything that's being unmade is being made, and basically a whole bunch of paradoxes that led to Zen and led to and all, you know, a lot of esoteric traditions that basically see the world as being these nothing but paradoxes and tautologies. And the beauty of that. And so what people do is they basically become meditative and obsessive of doodling around with these beautiful patterns. And they forget the fact that they're not actually doing anything. It's basically a form of beauty escapism. So when you're raking in the sand in Zen, you're hypnotizing yourself to get lost in the beauty, which then makes you realize that there's nothing there, but then makes you remember that that's profound and that the something nothing relation and so on and so forth. And so you basically, your mind just gets your, the practices that you do in Kung Fu, the practices you do in martial arts and yoga, what are they really about? Ritual beautification. The breathing exercise in and of itself isn't important. What's important is that you do it over and over and over again and ritualize your body into some sort of rhythmic harmonies, okay, as an act of beauty more than an act of truth. And this is why yoga is so damn popular, is because it's an art form, not a science, not a true religion or philosophy. And so anyone can basically reinterpret it as a ritual form of beauty practice, no matter what the meaning is implied. There could be no meaning, there could be lots of meaning, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that it's ritual beauty practice. Same thing with martial arts. You don't actually have to practice it to like beat people up. You could do it just for the sake of making beautiful poses and saying, well, that looks nice. I like the way that looks. And then I feel good about myself because I feel beautiful and everything in my space is now centered and so on. So these are real practices. This is not bullshit. This is real stuff. I'm not trying to say there's nothing of value there. I'm saying what it actually is. It actually is ritual artistic practice. And it insists on itself as being its own purpose. It doesn't have to be true. Beauty doesn't have to be true. That's the great thing about beauty. It merely has to be beautiful. And the core of beauty is symmetry, dynamism, rhythm, and ritual. Okay, and the design principles that any artist works with to what we call these sacred geometries. And, you know, all the way up to like the 1700s, it was aristocrats, scholars, great people, Thomas Jefferson, you know, whatever. They used like this sort of Freemasonic language and symbolic language and occult influence languages. These were considered to be sort of like these para-rituals or parascientific activities that when you didn't have any true knowledge of something, you would go to the sacred geometry. If you needed to design a beautiful building, you would say, I'm going to embed it with lots of meaning. And by meaning, they mean sacred geometries, lots of symmetries, dense meaning. So the pillars stand for something and the circles represent something. And then, so they basically, when they build like the White House or like the, you know, any great building or monument or whatever, it's absolutely rich and dense with symbolic patterns that are meant to not only like say call on divine forces or something, which is like the occult interpretation, or that you call on the other, but what it does is it actually directly influences the observer to see something as being very beautiful and then want to go to the next level of depth to unearth the mysteries of what they don't know yet about it. And so like you see the building and you realize there's all these mysteries. And so you do investigations and you find out more and more of these things. And so this is a lot of what integral and metamodern can do, is basically, these are artistic concepts that can train you to want to know more, to want to go levels deeper into what's underneath it, in the same way that occultism can do that on its very any kind of esoteric practice or hermetic tradition. You know, the arts basically are about this. They are valid. However, they're not true. And this is one of the hardest things for artists and also non-artists to accept, is that art is both valid and not true. That's culture. Culture is, in my definition, the practices of meaning that are built on beauty that imply what ought to be good and true, but aren't good and true. So for example, a great piece of music, great Beethoven's Ninth, okay, Ode to Joy, is a form of beauty that is meant to represent goodness and truth. And of course, this is what Goethe taught later. This is very much what people were teaching in artistic circles from the 1700s through the 1900s, was that art is beauty that is supposed to influence our emotions and thoughts and feelings, to compel things as being good or true, or both. Or if it's anti-art, it's the opposite. We're using art to compel us to think against things, to invert truth or invert goodness, to challenge morality or to challenge what we accept to be true, if it's subversive. So subversive art is basically like that. But the art itself can only say that it's insisting on itself. It can only say that it's tautological, that if you accept its tautologies as beautiful, and you say that's tautology is supersymmetry, and if you accept that as beautiful, say, wow, that resonates with me and I would like to reproduce some of that beauty, then it can get you to believe that truth and goodness are dependent on that beauty, that to go outside of that beauty would to be moving away from goodness or to be moving away from truth. So the problem is art runs up against everything else. Okay. And so the culture, which is basically the accumulative practice of art and beauty, can become it's a very messy rivalrous space. It can be a Tower of Babel. It can be a zero-sum game. And it can also often pose as a positive sum game or a win-win or a cooperative activity with no rivalry. But the thing is that what the artistic people never tell you is that for every cooperative movement in art where you get people to synchronize in beliefs about beauty or about, culture in general, remember here, I'm kind of saying this is a beauty theory of culture, but so don't forget that. So beauty here represents culture, so that the artist will tell you that we're trying to create a cooperative movement because beauty always appears to cooperation being symmetry, cooperation being synchronicity, cooperation being rhythm. Okay. Unfortunately, what they're not telling you is that they're creating a counterforce, because with every wave, there's a crest and a nadir. So basically it goes up and down. All right. And so there's an action and a reaction. Okay. And why is there a reaction? Because this art is attempting to displace other organizational knowledge and other structures in reality. It can't be otherwise. There's no vacuum in culture. So as art gets created, it creates its own enemies. And the more cooperative and the greater the harmony and the symmetry inside that art as a cultural movement, the greater the opposition is from every other force that does not harmonize with it. And so all these harmonic resonances are held up by force. And then eventually there's going to be some sort of what we call collapse, which I rephrase as displacement. So basically the cultural movement expands and then eventually is displaced. There's no vacuum. And the initial displacement is often what feels like chaos. And by this in common speech, we mean a mess and scary and uncertain and dangerous. But it also means that the chaos that we see actually has an underlying order to it. It just hasn't yet recalibrated. So it's kind of like anti-symmetry for a period of time. And so we perceive this as a threat. It's anti-truth, it's anti-good. Because remember, we define those things through our super tautologies of beauty. And so what happens is that when culture collapses, it's actually being displaced by an inevitable restructuring that has already taken place that looks like a mess, but it's already inevitably on a path to a new system state. And that new system state is going to realign beauty. Okay, so the paradigm shift comes about when we basically see words, objects, relations, and ideas in culture, and all of a sudden we have a polarization, a polarized shift in how we interpret those things. So language shifts, the use of language, the emotions shift, the definitions of what's funny, the definitions of what's mean or nice or kind or angry or whatever repolarizes. And it's freaky if you don't know that that's how it works. And so you and I could be reading the same words on the same paper, but because cultural symmetries have repolarized, we interpret them differently. And your beauty is now ugly to me because I see it as being false beauty, or cacophony, basically ugly words, because it's not polarized correctly. It has not kept up with the recalibration of culture. And so the very ideas of like, what principles of culture and society are the beautiful ideas repolarizes. And the problem is that there's a very limited language with which we express beauty. Music is very well understood. It's a very tight language. Music is very tight. Visual art is incredibly tight. There's only so many basic sacred geometries you can work with. You kind of have like boxes and fractals and triangles and circles, and then you play with sort of these relations, and pretty soon you run out of geometry on a flat surface, and then you have to do 3D art. And then the funny thing is that you end up just recreating everything you've ever seen. And 3D art just basically draws from nature, or the opposite, or the unnatural, the synthetic, what we call like the artificial. And so things like squares are artificial because, you don't find perfect squares in nature. Things like leaves are natural. And so anyway, art just becomes these languages that we can learn a couple of years in college, and we can learn a pretty extensive set of, design principles and tools with which to build all art that we build. The languages are limited, just like we say in narratives, there's only so many plots. All stories have certain basic plot structures, and the nuances are really all the action. And the nuances are very subtle between one story and another. And so myths all look similar because there's only so many different structural relations in human relationships from which to draw myths. You have, parents and children and cousins and kin, and Claude Lévi-Strauss went in through a lot of this, that basically when you look at these various different grammars of relation, you realize it's fairly limited. And so culture basically is, I'm trying to drive home this point that you have these basic design languages with which to make art. And what culture is it's a new polarization of design principles, cultural paradigms, which allows us to interpret beauty differently. And once we do that, the palettes are different, that we paint with. So for example, electronic dance music versus classical music. And that there is always an intimate relation between this new definition of beauty and the progress of the other major paradigms that aren't cultural. And that means right now I say, techno-economic, scientific, and political paradigms. There's always an intimate interrelationship, but specifically the cultural side is the lens of beauty on which we cast society as a meaningful and organized. And that paradigm shifts in culture are shifts in polarities of how we see symmetries and patterns, and which sort of design principles and sacred geometries we favor in our language. And the reason why we choose to favor these things is because we see these cultural things as being supportive of the other social activities. They help to make sense of science. They help to make sense of technology. They help to make us reorganize all these other advances in knowledge so that there is some illusion of meaning from the relationship between beauty and goodness and truth. Okay. And so that's really what culture is all about. And so I see integral and metamodern as being artistic experiments in redesigning what counts as beautiful that is an echo of every other non-dualistic philosophy that has ever existed at regular intervals in history. And the claim of the people who support these ideas is that this is right. This is the correct sort of harmonic interpretations for the present. And that where we need to be as a society to repair the mistakes of going too rigid or too critical and so forth is to go to super symmetrical. And so to put truth and untruth down and good and not good down for a while, and to focus on beauty as basically the core. And so I'm arguing that non-dualistic philosophies are culture dominant philosophies where you're trying to reestablish the cultural paradigm as supreme over the other paradigms by using supersymmetry and as being your organizing principle for the future. So this is my theory of what metamodernism is and trying to be. This is why I say I have a more complete and thorough explanation philosophically of what's going on in society, because this is how it actually works. Now, here's my counterclaim. What if they are wrong? What if they are wrong about super symmetrical, non-dualistic, sort of like Taoist type influenced, everything is everything models of reality? What if that's not where we're going? What if that is a reaction to where we're going out of fear of the opposite? What if we are afraid that beauty and culture is at an all-time low in importance, and that this is a movement that is attempting to resuscitate beauty so that it becomes elevated to the highest as opposed to the lowest concern? I'm going to make an argument that we're not in the right place for that yet. My claim is that we are too early. And I've made this claim to people like Zachary Stein and to people like Michelle Bowens and to other of my friends, that this anticipation of supersymmetry and beauty is almost a desperate call to ancient Asia and ancient Eastern religion to save the world with symmetry and harmony as the defining principle of our time, because that would basically be the interplanetary or the global solution is global harmony. And so if we're trying to achieve global harmony, it would seem obvious that a global beauty movement or a super symmetrical movement would get us there, so that the world would be like a giant gem rather than a complex adaptive system. And so as a giant gem, it could achieve some sort of second order stability. You know, it moves, but it moves smoothly, without friction, without conflict, sort of like a conflict-free society. And we're going to achieve conflict-free by all meditating on the same beautiful ideas. And so if we all become indoctrinated by that same system of beauty, we wouldn't have any way to oppose that harmony. We would all be synchronized in that system by the virtue of believing in it. And so it becomes super tautological. And so it insists on itself as a solution. It says, well, look, if we were able to do this, all we would have to do is all believe in supersymmetry, and we would be supersymmetrical. We would do that. However, that requires basically killing the human uniqueness and weirdness and strangeness of relationships and interactions that are not globally symmetrical. So what I'm arguing is instead, the reason why we're doing this is because we're afraid that science is about to become the supersymmetry. And it would be ugly. Artificial intelligence, strong AI, global surveillance, global economy, global circular economy, one world system that basically incorporates everything into a global totality based on the super scientific capabilities of AI and humans who assist it. And that this thing would not be pretty. It would basically be anti-beauty. It would be truth, truth, truth. It would be truth. It would kill goodness. It would kill beauty, all at the sake of truth. Okay? And so goodness and beauty basically have no role in such a world, because it would be hyper-rational. And so in fear of this, people are seeking for a super beauty or super good. And a super good is some sort of like, you know, global moral revival. And moral revivals always have to do with your practice, not your belief. Whereas beauty revivals have to do with your belief, not your practice. And I'm arguing that metamodernism and integralism are terrible for creating practice. They're terrible for creating praxis, or whatever you want to call it. They are things you meditate on for the sake of meditating on them. They are, again, you don't, integral doesn't give you heuristics by which to solve problems. What it says is meditate on the beauty of something and then go figure out how to solve the problem after the meditation. Figure it out yourself. And, you know, just draw on the inspiration of what you learned from meditating on these concepts to do something. So there's no direct connection between the two. Goodness actually gives you a direct connection where it says you must behave well. You must follow good practices. You must follow deontology. And if you behave well, you will get good outcomes. Truth is consequentialist. It basically says, if then. So again, what if we're wrong? And what if there is another way to solve this problem? What if there is a new logic that we can create that is separate from science and culture? What if we can create a logic that actually is novel in the same way that economics became novel with the development of insurance, banking, abstract finance, and utility theory? And that was a truly novel creation in human history to fully develop that. In the same way that scientific revolution was truly novel. It developed things that, now clearly there was some pre-science that was impressive, and it wasn't like it came out of nowhere, but it really eventually became discontinuous as a separate institutional logic. So now what I'm arguing is, if we want to develop a new logic, we cannot just use meta-modern culture. That's not going to develop us the new logic. That will develop us yet another revival of a cultural phase that we've all just, history rhymes. It doesn't exactly repeat itself. And so it's just another non-dualistic period of beauty super tautologies. Do I think that's going to solve our problems? No, I actually feel as if we already know better. We know that we are going to have that stuff, but that's merely cultural. And the cultural is not going to be the biggest paradigm of the paradigms of our time, and it won't be the solutions to our existential problems. It will be simply what I would consider to be the pleasantry of our lives. I argue that we need a new magisteria, which is not just a separate system of institutions, but a new kind of paradigm that is not simply collapsible or reducible into the others. So we need to get a little bit past things such as beauty, goodness, and truth. By the way, I don't think that was a complete system, because I don't think that science is truth, culture being beauty, and then we have also techno-economics and politics. And we would say politics is supposed to be the representative of goodness, in terms of who goodness is the interactive results of human beings' behaviors and positive outcomes for other humans. And politics is supposed to be the mass manipulation of that. So the mass manipulation of what counts as good in a civil society, okay, which is all there is. There's nothing outside of that anymore. We're all civilians now. So everything is civil society. I believe that there's a little bit more to that, and that's Goethe did not describe techno-economics or the techno-economy. It's not quite true, good, or beautiful. It is progress. In other words, it's power. And so power in a literal sense, which means it's tools, it's the means to ends. It is the most practical of all of the major systems of knowing, is the ability to produce useful tools that get things done. It is ultimately pragmatic. And so if we say that we're pragmatic, we say that we are techno-economic in our bias, which says everything is a tool. Everything is a tool to get a job done. And that's how we evaluate it, is does it do the job? Does it have the power or the competence to functionally complete the task? And so that's what techno-economy is all about. And we've been heavily biased towards that. And I'm a believer in the value of that, because that's the true progress in human history, is the accumulation of tools that solve problems. Whereas most of these other things are a little more recursive, and there hasn't been so much progress as much as there's been cycles and rhythms and so forth. And so then politics, of course, then becomes the argument of it's a form of power, and you could also call it power, but instead of it being practical power to get things done with tools, it's the opposite. It's practical power it's redistribution of power that has already been created. So now that power exists, you redistribute it. And the theory is that you have to use complex and subtle reasonings about what counts as good to make those decisions. And no matter what, there's always going to be trade-offs. That's politics. And what I'm saying is these four do not solve our existential problems anymore. We need the commons. We need the commons as being its own kind of logic. It's not power. It's not goodness. It's not beauty. It's not even truth. What it is balance. And I'm still working on exactly how to define this. And so bear with me, because this is not a finished work. But in the creation of the commons, we're looking to create a kind of balance that is a constraint on all of the others so that they can't collapse. And this, so basically, beauty grows to the point that it will collapse. Truth, science, creates things like it grows to the as we pursue knowledge, it basically creates limits for itself where it's no longer good, or it's no longer beautiful, or whatever. So truth can get pretty ugly. And so goodness also is not necessarily practical. It can't always be realized. It could be a good idea, it could be a good intention or good action, but the outcome isn't necessarily there. Okay, so the argument here is that we need to develop a fifth logic and scale it and make that increasingly important compared to the others. And that logic cannot be reduced to the others because it does not rely on the other logics. And that the commons, to me, is it's the kind of monism that is the opposite of non-dualism. So there's different kinds of monism. But so as you're trying to create this beauty of this non-dualistic language of beauty, you end up coming up against all these ugly truths and so forth, all these other lateral constraints. What I see the commons as is it's basically the forces of uncertainty that have been actually inverted and channeled to prevent displacements. So that instead of systems becoming displacing each other or achieving some sort of stasis, the commons would basically be the system of inherent complexity built on the logic of the earth that was pre-human, that basically uses the earth as a limit to everything that we produce. So basically it's the subject, all these other things are growth of the human condition, expansion, knowledge growth from inside the mind of the body out. And to me, the commons is a perspective that puts humans as a peripheral agent in the whole system. And all of the human logics as basically decentered. And then what we do when we do that is we also accept that any language of beauty or truth or so forth, which comes through human, is bad. And so this is what I would call a sort of transhumanity on the path to post-humanity, where we imagine sharing the universe with other forms of sentience, full well knowing we'll never understand them, and being willing to fragment humanity. There's only two options. We can either create a super singularity, a sort of Borg-like totality, where humans finally master and control their entire environment and then synchronize it such that it doesn't need to change anymore, other than in just incremental ways, a sort of total stasis. And the exact opposite is a system that channels the complexity and chaos of post-human things to actually fragment human. So I'm going to argue that maybe transhuman is not the full definition, but at least where we are right now, it's a pretty good definition. I prefer it to metamodern. Metamodern is culture, as I said, it's beauty. Uh, the transhuman perspective is the perspective that the human is in many ways an illusion. And instead of trying to unify us as a single type of thing with a single type of system that totalizes the world, we need to go the exact opposite direction and encourage people to become trans or even post-human in all different directions. A new great scattering where we are basically, instead of birthing one master post-human race or one final human condition, you know, the end of history is a final human condition that we all agree on. Instead, we're looking at multiple post-human sentience entities that we will share the world with. And the commons is the acceptance of a world model or a world system that is not only good for humanity, but good for post-humanity. In other words, it is inclusive of the things that we are about to become in many different directions. With genetic engineering, with artificial augmentation, cybernetics, all of these things that we've been talking about in science fiction for 100, 200 years, or speculative futures, it's all going to happen. When the technology gets there, it's all going to happen. And the state of the world we're going through in the 21st century is we're going through a commons transition where we are going to be recreating the world as a place where all forms of sentience that aren't us develop more quickly for their own purposes, and that all forms of sentience that we are creating are syntheos, whether it be a god like syntheism as opposed to creating gods, or synhumanism to create just other sentience. Those sorts of things are going to be the new polytheism, basically. And the monotheism is like the cult of a singularist future. And so what I explain in my book is not just the relationship of culture and how culture works, but basically, and the commons, but basically the language of the world that we are moving into, and how to understand it, and how to realize that we've always been going there, and that the rhythms of history will continue to help us to understand where we're going into the future. And I'll be happy to talk more about this. Thanks.